The park was alive that afternoon. Golden leaves tumbling through the air like slow-falling confetti, children's laughter rippling across the pond, and the faint smell of roasted chestnuts drifting from a nearby vendor. I sat on a weathered bench beneath an old maple tree, my hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Thomas was in the field, tossing a ball with Sam. Every time our son missed and the ball rolled away, his laughter filled the air, bright, unbothered, free. Thomas would ruffle his hair, pretending to scold him, and Sam would giggle until he hiccuped. Watching them together always filled me with something I couldn't name. Maybe gratitude, maybe awe. For years I thought I'd never hear a child call me Mom. And then I saw him. He was sitting on the far side of the park, beneath the shadow of a tree stripped nearly bare. At first I wasn't sure it was him. His posture was smaller somehow, his once proud shoulders drawn inward, as though life had been quietly folding him away. But when the wind caught his hair and I saw the streaks of gray, the familiar cut of his jaw, I knew. Richard, my ex-husband. The man who once called me Barren as though it were my name. He didn't see me right away. His gaze was somewhere far off, lost in the laughter of other people's children. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw a tremor in his hand, a tiny shake as he lifted a thermos to his lips. The same hands that once slammed doors, crumpled medical papers, and pointed at me with disgust. When his eyes finally met mine, something changed in his face. There was no flash of anger, no hint of the arrogance that used to define him. Only quiet recognition. And a shadow of regret so deep it almost hurt to look at. Thomas called out from the field, "Evelyn, you're up next." His voice carried warmth, the kind that had built me back piece by piece. I smiled, waved, and for a moment, Richard's gaze followed the movement of my hand, to the wedding band that wasn't his. Sam came running toward me, cheeks flushed, eyes bright. "Mom, did you see me catch it?" I laughed, crouching to his height. "I did, sweetheart." "You were perfect." Richard looked away. I wanted to feel anger, the kind that used to burn in my chest whenever his name was mentioned. But I didn't. What I felt was heavier, quieter, a pity touched with peace. He had his chance at happiness and threw it away with his pride. And now he sat alone among fallen leaves while my son's laughter filled the world I built after him. As I stood, taking Sam's hand, the breeze caught a few golden leaves and sent them spiraling between us, a curtain of time and consequence. He once called me Barren. But looking at my son's smile that day, I realized he was the empty one. They say every love story begins with a promise. Mine began with a prayer. I was 27 on my wedding day, old enough to know life isn't a fairy tale, but still young enough to believe love could conquer anything. The church smelled of lilies and old wood polish, sunlight spilling through the stained glass and soft colors that painted my veil. Richard stood at the altar, tall and confident, his smile wide enough to make me forget every fear I had ever known. Everyone said we were perfect together. He was everything a small-town girl could hope for, handsome in that sharp, magazine way, ambitious, respected, the kind of man who carried his mother's approval like a crown. And me. I was just Evelyn Grace Whitman, a schoolteacher who loved poetry, quiet mornings, and the sound of rain. I didn't have much to offer, but I gave him everything I had, my heart, my faith, my forever. I remember my mother holding my hands before the ceremony, her eyes glistening as she whispered a verse she always loved. "Love is patient. Love is kind." She squeezed my fingers and smiled. "Remember that, darling? Patience can heal anything." At the time, I believed her. The first months were a dream stitched together with small joys, Sunday breakfasts, evening walks, his laughter echoing down the hallway of our new home. He'd bring me flowers from the garden, always the same kind. White lilies because he said they looked like purity. We were building something together, or so I thought. We talked about everything. Travel, dreams, the future. And one day, children, he wanted a big family, a house full of laughter and noise. I told him I wanted that too. It was one of the few times his eyes softened. The only time he looked less like a man trying to impress the world and more like a boy who still believed in it. But then, the questions began. They started innocently. Richard's mother would smile too tightly at family dinners. "So, Evelyn, any good news yet?" she'd say, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. At first, I laughed. Not yet, but soon, I hope. But soon became her favorite word to echo back at me, coded in something I couldn't quite name. Disappointment, maybe. Or accusation. A year passed. Then two. Richard changed in quiet ways. He still kissed my cheek before leaving for work, but it became a habit more than a gesture. His voice lost its warmth when he spoke to me, his eyes drifting elsewhere during dinner. Sometimes he'd sigh without realizing, the kind of sigh that made me feel small, like an inconvenience. I started visiting the doctor, scheduling quiet appointments he never asked about. I wanted to be sure. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was timing. The tests always came back the same. Nothing wrong. "Be patient," the doctor said. These things take time, but patience felt heavier when it wasn't shared. Richard's mother's whispers grew bolder. I'd catch her murmuring to neighbors, to relatives, always when she thought I was out of earshot. It's such a shame. Poor Richard. Such a strong man deserves an heir. Heir, not child, not family, just heir. One evening, I found him sitting in the living room staring at the fire. "Maybe you should pray harder," he said quietly, without looking at me. I wanted to ask if he still loved me. But the words tangled in my throat. I told myself he was just frustrated, that we both were. I told myself it would pass. At night, I'd lie awake beside him, counting the spaces between his breaths. Once upon a time, I used to rest my head on his chest and feel at home. Now the silence between us was louder than any argument. I tried everything. Diets, vitamins, prayers, hope. Each month brought the same heartbreak, the same empty line on a test, the same hollow smile in the mirror. And yet, I kept hearing my mother's words. Love is patient. I clung to that like a lifeline. I told myself patience could fix us. That love, even wounded, could still heal. But the truth is, patience cannot grow flowers in barren soil. It can only watch the season change, pretending spring will come. And though I smiled through every dinner, every pointed question, every fading touch, something inside me was already withering. Love was supposed to be enough. It was supposed to save us, but months turned into years, and love began to sound like a word I no longer recognized. By our second anniversary, the laughter in our home had grown quieter. Not gone, just dimmed, like a candle burning low. The walls that once echoed with music and conversation now held their breath. Even the air between us had changed, heavier somehow, as if it knew something we didn't want to say aloud. I still tried to keep hope alive. I woke early, cooked his favorite breakfasts, placed flowers on the table, and pretended not to notice how often they wilted before he did. We had started visiting doctors then. I remember the sterile smell of the clinic, the soft hum of machines, the polite smiles of nurses who seemed to know what kind of pain was sitting in that waiting room. The first time, Richard held my hand. The second time, he waited in the car. By the third, he didn't come at all. The tests were always the same. Endless vials, charts, and hopeful looks that went nowhere. Each result ended with that same gentle reassurance. "Everything looks fine. Mrs. Whitman, sometimes it just takes time." I clung to those words like scripture, but time can be a cruel mirror. When I came home from another appointment one afternoon, holding a pamphlet the doctor had given me, I found Richard sitting on the couch, shoes still on, staring at the television that wasn't even turned on. "Doctor says we should both get tested," I said softly, trying to sound casual, just to rule things out. He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, the muscle ticking like a clock counting down. "Both?" he repeated. "Yes," I said carefully. "It's routine. Sometimes the issue can—" He cut me off with a sharp laugh. "You think this is about me? I felt my stomach twist. No, The doctor said it's better to be sure. Together. His laugh turned colder. I don't need a doctor to tell me I'm fine. The problem isn't me, Evelyn. There was no shouting. No slammed doors. Just that flat tone. That simple sentence. Heavy enough to shatter something fragile between us. I opened my mouth to speak, to calm him, but the words slipped away. He grabbed his keys, muttered something about being late for work, and left. The door closed softly, but the echo lingered. That night, I sat alone at the dinner table, watching his untouched plate of food grow cold. I traced circles on the tablecloth with my fingertip, as if I could erase the tension from our lives with small, careful motions. When I finally heard the front door open hours later, I didn't ask where he'd been. His cologne smelled faintly different, not wrong, just unfamiliar. He walked past me without a word and lay down on the couch, still in his shirt and tie. I stood in the hallway for a long time, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. Once, that sound had comforted me. Tonight, it only reminded me how far away he'd gone. The next morning, I told myself it was just a bad night. That he'd come around, that he'd remember the vows we made. But his chair at breakfast stayed empty, and the silence between us grew thicker. Days turned to weeks, and he came home later each evening. When I asked if everything was all right, he'd mutter, "Just tired," and pour himself a drink. He was no longer the man who teased me for humming while I cooked, or who brought me lilies on Tuesdays just because. That version of Richard existed in the photographs on our mantel, smiling, young, untouched by disappointment. I started hiding the doctor's appointment cards in drawers. I stopped mentioning hope aloud because hope had started to sound like begging. Still, I prayed at night. Quietly, beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock. "Please," I'd whisper, "please just let this be enough. Let him still love me." But even prayers felt heavy when you said them alone. One evening, after another quiet dinner, I tried to bridge the gap again. "Maybe we could take a small trip," I said softly. "Get away for a weekend. You used to love the lake. He didn't even look up. Maybe you should focus on fixing what's broken instead of planning vacations." The words hit harder than any shout could. I nodded, pretending to agree, pretending I wasn't breaking. Later that night, I went to bed alone. I could hear the faint creak of the couch downstairs, the turning of pages from a book he wasn't really reading. I pressed my face into the pillow, biting back the sound in my throat. I didn't want him to hear me cry. I didn't want him to think I was weak, but tears have a way of finding the cracks you try to hide. That was the first night I cried quietly. Not because he doubted me, but because I began to doubt myself. The envelope was thinner than I expected. It felt too light to hold something that heavy. I sat in the clinic's waiting room with it pressed between my palms, my name typed neatly across the front, Evelyn Grace Whitman. The doctor had explained the results gently, choosing her words as if each one might bruise me. "Your markers are slightly low," she'd said, her voice calm and careful. "But this isn't a final diagnosis, Mrs. Whitman. It only means we should run a few more tests. For both of you. Sometimes fertility issues are complex, not conclusive." I nodded, even managed a small smile. "So, it's not certain." "Not at all," she said kindly. "It's only a maybe. A maybe." A fragile word, small enough to hold hope, but sharp enough to cut it. I thanked her, folded the paper, and told myself I'd explain everything to Richard that evening. Gently, clearly, the way our vows had taught us to face things, together. But fate doesn't always wait for explanations. When I got home, Richard was already there. He had come home early, something he hadn't done in months. His jacket was still on, tie loosened, glass of whiskey half finished on the counter. "You're home," I said softly, surprised. He turned, eyes narrowing. "What's that?" I froze. The envelope was still in my hand. "Oh, it's from the clinic," I said, trying to sound calm. "The doctor said." He snatched it before I could finish. "Richard, wait," I began, reaching for it. but his fingers were already tearing at the seal. His eyes darted over the paper, scanning too quickly to really understand. But he stopped when he found the line. Low ovarian markers. Recommend further evaluation. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. "So it's you," he said at last, his voice flat and cold. "Richard, please," I whispered. "It's not final." The doctor said. He threw the paper onto the table, the edges fluttering like wings of something broken. "You've been dragging me to doctors for 2 years, making me waste my time, and all along we didn't know," I said, my voice shaking. "That's why both of us—" He cut me off, voice rising. "Don't you dare turn this on me. You heard the result. It's you." There it was, the verdict, spoken like a truth carved in stone. He paced the kitchen, his hand dragging through his hair, his words turning sharper. "Do you know what this means? What my family will say? My mother's been right all along." I stepped closer, reaching out. "Richard, listen to me. It's not—" He pulled away. Don't. Then he grabbed his phone, dialed a number, and walked into the hallway. His voice dropped low, but I knew exactly who he was calling. His mother. The conversation was short, clipped. When he returned, his face was pale with anger, or maybe shame. He didn't look at me. "I'm going out," he said, reaching for his coat. "Where?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer. The door shut hard behind him. I stood there for a long time, staring at the paper on the table, the one that had turned my home into a courtroom. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Low fertility markers. Such a small phrase to destroy something so big. I picked it up, pressed it to my chest like it might stop the ache beneath my ribs. "It's only a maybe," I whispered to myself. Not a sentence. But deep down, I knew, for him, maybe was already too much. By nightfall, the phone rang. A friend from the church? Her tone awkward, hesitant. "Evelyn, I don't mean to pry, but I heard you and Richard are having some trouble." I thanked her, told her it was a misunderstanding, and hung up before my voice could break. That's how gossip works in small towns. It moves faster than truth. Later, I sat by the window with the lights off, watching the street lamps flicker. Richard still hadn't come home. His side of the bed would stay untouched again. I wondered if he was with his mother or with someone else entirely. The thought made my stomach twist, but I swallowed it down. I didn't want to believe the worst. All I wanted was a chance to explain, to tell him the doctor wasn't certain, that there was still hope. That maybe love could survive this, but love, it seemed, was easier to doubt than to defend. When the first light of morning touched the curtains, I finally heard the sound of the front door. His footsteps were slow, deliberate. I waited, half hoping he'd come upstairs, touch my shoulder and say we'd figure it out together. Instead, he walked straight past the bedroom door, and for the first time in our marriage, he didn't call me Eve, he just muttered to himself, cold and distant, a stranger in my house, and started calling me her. It was a Saturday evening, the kind that used to mean movie nights and takeout after a long week of work. But that evening, Richard insisted we go to his parents' house for dinner. "I haven't been in weeks," he said, straightening his tie in the mirror. "They're worried about me." I didn't ask if they were worried about us. I dressed carefully anyway. A soft blue dress. The one he once said made my eyes look like calm water. That felt like a lifetime ago. When we arrived, the Whitman house smelled of roasted lamb and rosemary. His mother, Margaret, greeted him first, arms open wide. She looked past me like I was a shadow she'd rather not acknowledge. "Richard," she cooed. "You look tired, darling. Work must be hard with everything going on." Everything going on. The phrase slid between us like a blade. His father grunted from the head of the table, offering a stiff nod. His brothers were already seated, their wives whispering across porcelain plates. I smiled politely, said my hellos, and sat down beside Richard. My hands rested on my lap, fingers twisting my wedding band. Dinner began quietly. Too quietly. Forks clinked against china, glasses filled and refilled. The conversation drifted from politics to real estate, from someone's promotion to someone else's new baby. Margaret turned to one of the wives and said, a little too loudly, "How far along are you now, dear?" 6 months, the woman beamed. "Oh, how wonderful," Margaret said, eyes flicking toward me. Nothing makes a marriage stronger than a child. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard cleared his throat, pushing the potatoes around his plate. Then, with a deep sigh, he said, "Actually, I've been thinking a lot about that lately." I looked up, heart thudding. "About what?" He didn't meet my gaze. Instead, he spoke to the table, to his family. "I think maybe it's time I start moving on." The fork slipped from my hand. "Moving on?" Margaret repeated, a slow smile spreading. "You mean—" "I mean," Richard said, his voice firm now, "a man deserves children. A real family. I've tried, but—" He gestured vaguely toward me. "It's not meant to be." For a second, I thought I might be sick. Everyone stared. The world shrank to the sound of my own breathing. I waited for him to laugh, to say it was a joke, anything. But he didn't. Margaret placed her hand over his. "You've done your best, son. No one can blame you." Her words wrapped around him like approval and around me like a noose. I wanted to stand, to scream, to tell them the truth, that the tests weren't final, that we hadn't even tried everything yet, that love wasn't supposed to break this way, but I didn't. I sat perfectly still, a statue sculpted out of shame. Because what could I say that wouldn't make me sound desperate? What could I defend that hadn't already been taken from me? The conversation moved on without me. Someone asked about a business trip. Someone else laughed too loudly. I stared at my untouched food and imagined the version of me who once believed patience could fix anything. She would have smiled and held his hand. That woman was gone now. When dinner ended, I thanked his mother for the meal. My voice didn't shake. I didn't give her that satisfaction. The car ride home was silent until the streetlights blurred by. Then he spoke, voice low but sharp enough to cut. "I can't live like this anymore, Eve." I looked at him. "Like what?" He kept his eyes on the road. "In a house that's quiet. In a life that feels unfinished." Tears welled up, but I blinked them away. "Unfinished? We can still—" He interrupted. "I need a real family." My throat tightened. "I am your family," I said, barely a whisper. He didn't reply. He just kept driving, his face expressionless, his jaw clenched. The streetlights painted him in flashes of gold and shadow, a man halfway between guilt and indifference. When we reached home, he didn't wait for me to speak. He went inside, grabbed a few papers from his desk, and sat down at the dining table, his pen scratched across the page. I watched from the doorway, too stunned to move. "What are you doing?" "Starting the process," he said simply. "You'll get the papers tomorrow." The next morning, the doorbell rang. A man in a gray suit handed me an envelope. Legal paper, thick, official, final. Divorce. I stood there in my nightgown, the ink still drying on my fingers from where I'd tried to paint hope onto something that had already died. When I signed my name, my hand trembled. Not from fear, but from the realization that this was it. I wasn't just signing a document. I was signing away the woman I used to be. The house looked different once his things were gone. Not emptier, just quieter. I stood in the middle of what used to be our living room, staring at the faint square of color where his wedding portrait had hung. The walls echoed with absence. Even the clock seemed hesitant to tick, as if afraid to disturb the silence he left behind. When I finally turned the key in the door for the last time, I didn't cry. The tears had already run dry. What was left wasn't sorrow. It was something heavier, like dust that clings to everything you touch. I moved into a small cottage on the edge of town, the kind people describe as cozy when they're trying not to say lonely. It had peeling white paint, a squeaky gate, and a view of a wide, empty field that changed with the seasons. The first night I couldn't sleep. The wind brushed against the windows, and every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, reminded me that I was alone. But there was something strangely freeing about it, too. No footsteps pacing the hallway. No slammed doors. No cold silence waiting after every argument, just me. I spent the next few days unpacking slowly. Each item felt like a small act of defiance. The chipped teacup my mother gave me. My books lined up in careful order. The old record player I'd forgotten I owned. One afternoon, while hanging curtains, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. Hair messy, face bare, eyes tired, but softer somehow. "This is home now," I whispered. It sounded both like a promise and a surrender. The town was small, and news traveled fast. By the end of the week, everyone knew that Evelyn Whitman had moved into the cottage alone. At the grocery store, whispers trailed behind me like invisible smoke. Such a shame. She couldn't give him a child. I heard he already moved on. Poor thing. Must be hard, living all alone. I learned to smile politely and keep walking. Words couldn't kill you, but they could bruise. And I had enough bruises no one could see. Still, there were moments when loneliness pressed against me so tightly it was hard to breathe. At night, I'd make tea for one, sit by the window, and listen to the hum of life happening somewhere else. Laughter spilling from a neighbor's porch. A baby crying in the house next door. I thought about how quiet my life had become, and how maybe that wasn't such a terrible thing. Weeks passed, then months. The rhythm of solitude began to feel like music I could live with. One morning, as I walked past the elementary school, I noticed a flyer posted on the gate. Volunteers needed, school library program. I hesitated. My heart had grown timid, like a bird unsure if it could still fly. But something about the word library called to me. Books had always been my refuge, safe, forgiving places where pain could exist without judgment. So, the next day, I went. The librarian, a kind woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, greeted me warmly. "Are you the new volunteer?" I nodded. "If you'll have me," her smile widened. "We always have room for someone who loves stories." The first time I walked into that little library, it smelled of dust and crayons, the scent of old pages and young dreams. The shelves were crooked, the chairs mismatched, and sunlight spilled across the floor like a golden invitation. Children's laughter echoed down the hallway, bright and innocent. It filled the empty corners inside me that had long been silent. I spent the mornings shelving books, reading aloud to second graders, and helping them find stories about dragons and heroes and faraway kingdoms. And slowly, something inside me began to heal. Their laughter didn't sting like the laughter I used to hear at family dinners. It lifted me instead, light and unburdened. Each time a child smiled up at me, clutching a book like a treasure, I felt the faintest pulse of warmth return to my chest. That small library became my sanctuary. I found peace in the rhythm of turning pages, in the whisper of stories too beautiful to be forgotten. One morning, as I was stacking a pile of returned books, the librarian called out, "Evelyn, could you help me bring in the boxes from the car?" I nodded and walked toward the front door. The sunlight was soft that day, filtering through the maple trees that lined the street. As I stepped outside, I noticed a man bent over the trunk of an old blue car, lifting a box of donated books. He looked up when he heard the door close. Our eyes met briefly, just a polite, passing glance. He had kind eyes, the sort that didn't flinch when they saw sadness. He smiled, small and genuine. "Need a hand?" I asked. He chuckled. "I was about to ask you the same." We both reached for the same box, and for a moment, our hands brushed. Something quiet but certain stirred inside me. Not recognition, but possibility. As we carried the boxes inside, I realized how strange it felt to smile without forcing it. And later, when I sat back at my desk, surrounded by children's laughter and the scent of old paper, I caught myself thinking, maybe this is how healing begins. It was on one of those quiet mornings that I met the man who would change everything, though I didn't know it then. The first time I saw Thomas Reed, he was standing on a ladder, hammer in hand, muttering softly to himself about uneven shelves. The school library smelled faintly of sawdust that morning, a scent that somehow mixed perfectly with the old paper and crayons. The janitor had warned me someone would be coming to repair the shelves near the back wall. I had expected a man who worked quickly, quietly, and left without a word. But Thomas wasn't like that. He was patient, with the shelves, with the noise, with the curious children who kept peeking around corners to watch him work. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-worn skin and hands that looked like they'd built more than furniture. There was a calmness about him, the kind that only comes from someone who's seen storms and learned not to fight the rain. When he noticed me standing there, he gave a small, almost shy smile. "Sorry about the noise," he said. "These old boards have a mind of their own." I smiled back, clutching a stack of books to my chest. "That's all right. They've been complaining for years. I'm glad someone's finally listening." He chuckled softly, a warm, low sound that filled the quiet corners of the room. Over the next few days, he became a steady presence in that little library. Each morning I'd find him already there, measuring wood, whistling under his breath, a thermos of coffee by his side. Sometimes the children would wander over to watch, wide-eyed as he let them hold a measuring tape or feel the smooth edge of a sanded plank. "You're good with them," I said one afternoon as we watched two boys race around his ladder. He smiled faintly. "Used to have a boy who liked to do the same." Something in his tone made me pause, gentle, but edged with quiet sorrow. I didn't ask. And he didn't explain. That became the unspoken rule between us. We didn't pry, we just talked about everything else. Our lunches started as coincidences. He'd unwrap his sandwich on the bench outside, and I'd happen to bring my lunch at the same time. After a few days, it wasn't coincidence anymore. He'd save me a spot. I'd bring extra fruit or a piece of pie. We'd talk about the little things, the changing weather, the books the children loved, how the town seemed frozen in time. Once, he caught me staring at the rough scar that ran along his wrist. "Carpentry accident," he said before I could ask. "Teaches you to respect what you build." Then, after a pause, he added softly, "And what you lose." That was the first time I realized he wasn't just a man who fixed wood. He was a man still repairing something inside himself. He told me he was widowed. His wife, Clara, had passed away 5 years earlier. They had one son, now grown and working out of state. "She was the patient one," he said with a small smile. "Taught me that some things are worth fixing, even when they don't look broken to anyone else." His words lingered with me long after he said them. For the first time in years, someone spoke to me without pity. He didn't see a woman left behind, he saw a person still standing. Days turned into weeks, and the shelves in the library began to take new shape, stronger, smoother, beautiful in their imperfection. One afternoon, as he packed up his tools, I ran my fingers along the edge of a newly built shelf. "It's lovely," I said. "Feels like it was always meant to be here." He looked up at me, his eyes soft but steady. "Everything worth keeping should feel that way," he said. Then, after a pause, "Everyone deserves something that lasts." Something fluttered in my chest, quiet and unfamiliar. It wasn't love, not yet. It was warmth, a remembering of what it felt like to be seen without judgment. When he smiled at me, it wasn't the way Richard once did, with pride or possession. It was gentler, like he was looking at someone who mattered simply because she existed. One Friday afternoon, as the school emptied out and the golden light slanted through the windows, he lingered by the door, toolbox in hand. "Library looks different," he said. "It does," I agreed. "Feels alive again." He nodded once, hesitating before adding, "You do too." For a moment, I couldn't find words. It had been years since anyone looked at me and saw something alive. After he left, I stood in the empty room, tracing my fingers over the smooth wood he'd crafted, and thought, maybe healing didn't come in one grand moment of forgiveness or revenge. Maybe it came like this, slowly in gentle touches and kind words. Maybe this was the start of something new, but peace, I've learned, is a fragile thing. It doesn't announce its departure. It just slips away quietly, like sunlight fading behind a storm. The next morning, I returned home to find a large, cream-colored envelope resting on my doorstep. My name written in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Tidy, confident, unmistakable. For a long time, I just stared at it. The sound of the wind pressing against the windows. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from, because some ghosts don't need doors to return. They know exactly where you live. But just as my heart began to heal, an envelope arrived, one that carried the ghost of my past. The envelope sat on my kitchen table like a sleeping snake, harmless. Until touched, I made tea before opening it, though I didn't drink a drop. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers along the sealed edge. The handwriting was neat, precise, familiar only because of how far I'd tried to forget it. Dr. Levin. I hadn't seen his name in years, not since the day he handed me that thin white sheet of paper that changed the shape of my life. The one Richard had snatched from my hands, read once, and turned into a verdict. For a long moment, I just stared at it, the steam from my untouched tea curling between us like breath. Then I broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter and another envelope marked confidential. The air around me seemed to thicken as I began to read. Dear Mrs. Whitman, I hope this letter finds you in peace and good health. It has taken me years to write this, and I do so with the deepest regret and a heavy heart. During a recent internal review of archived records, we discovered a clerical error in patient documentation from your fertility testing case 12 years ago. The results that were attributed to you, the ones indicating low fertility markers, were, in fact, your husband's. The files were misfiled under your name due to a labeling mistake made during lab processing. Your own results, correctly identified now, showed no indication of infertility. I understand the pain this may bring back, but truth, however delayed, deserves to be known. I cannot undo what was done, but I needed you to know that you were never at fault. It was human error. But truth has a way of finding its way home. With my deepest apologies, Dr. Samuel Levin and I read it once, then twice, then again, as if my eyes couldn't trust what they were seeing, the words blurred, my vision swimming. I pressed the paper to my chest as if holding it could make it more real. Richard's results. Not mine. All those years, the accusations, the humiliation, the divorce, all built on a mistake. I sank into the chair, my breath unsteady, the room spinning between past and present. My mind replayed the night he stormed out with that paper in hand, the look of disgust on his face, the whispers that followed, the shame that stuck to me like a second skin. All of it. All of it because of one misplaced file. For years, I'd carried that weight in silence, convincing myself I was the one who had failed. That my worth as a woman, a wife, a human being, had somehow been measured by an empty cradle. Now, holding that letter, it felt as if something deep inside me, something I hadn't even realized was still chained, finally broke free. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the afternoon sun spilled across the fields, soft and golden. The same light that had once felt so distant now wrapped around me like a quiet embrace. I should have felt rage. But I didn't. Anger required energy, a fire that once burned inside me, long since turned to ash. What I felt instead was something quieter, purer. Release. The tears came, but they weren't the same kind that used to shake my chest in the dark. These were soft, cleansing, the kind that didn't sting. I let them fall freely, every drop carrying away a little more of the shame, the doubt, the endless why me that had haunted me for years. For the first time, I didn't see myself as a woman broken. I saw a woman who survived a lie. I thought of Thomas, his steady hands, his patient words. Everyone deserves something that lasts. Maybe this was what he meant. Not permanence of love or marriage, but truth. The kind of truth that endures, even after years of silence. Later that evening, I took the letter outside and sat beneath the old oak tree behind my cottage. The sunset bled gold and rose across the horizon. I read the letter one last time, then folded it carefully and slipped it into my journal, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. It wasn't a reminder of pain anymore. It was proof that I had never been the failure he said I was. Proof that sometimes justice arrives late, but it arrives nonetheless. As the crickets began their quiet chorus, I closed my eyes and breathed in the night air. For the first time, it felt light, as if I could finally take up all the space I had once given away. And somewhere deep inside, the voice that had been silenced for so long began to whisper again, soft, steady, certain. I was never the broken one. For the first time, I whispered aloud, I was never the broken one. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it arrives like a whisper, quiet, almost tender, but sharp enough to cut through years of silence. It started 3 days after the letter arrived. I hadn't told anyone yet. The truth was still too fragile, like a newborn thing that needed warmth before it could face the world. I carried it around in my chest, a secret, a freedom and a wound all at once. Then, one morning, as I was organizing a new shipment of books at the library, Clara, the librarian and one of the kindest souls I knew, walked in with a look that was half shock, half curiosity. "Evelyn," she said, lowering her voice. "I don't mean to pry, but have you heard?" "Heard what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm, though something in her expression made my stomach tighten. She hesitated, glancing toward the door before leaning closer. "Your ex-husband, Richard. There's been—" Talk! In a small town like ours, that word could mean anything. But it never meant nothing. Clara continued carefully. Dr. Levin spoke to him. Apparently, he felt it was his duty, ethically, I suppose, to inform him about the error. It seems Richard wasn't too pleased. Her words hung between us like dust motes in sunlight. I didn't move. "Didn't speak," she went on softly. "Everyone's talking about it. He's been seen at the cafe, red-faced and muttering. Some say he confronted Dr. Levin. Others say he's keeping to himself. But Evelyn—" She paused, choosing her next words delicately. "People finally know the truth. About what really happened. About you." I set down the book I was holding. My hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. For years, those same voices had whispered, "Poor Richard, poor man, burdened with a barren wife." And now they whispered something new, something closer to justice. That afternoon, I walked home in silence. The air was crisp, heavy with the scent of rain. Every face I passed seemed to carry an unspoken apology. Small nods, polite smiles, the kind of sympathy that arrives too late to matter. I didn't hate them for it. They were only repeating what they had been told, and for years they had believed his version of the story. But as I reached my gate, I realized something unexpected. I felt no triumph, no glee, no satisfaction in knowing the truth had finally turned the mirror toward him. What I felt was pity for a man who had destroyed his own peace chasing someone else's blame. For a man who'd needed to humiliate someone to feel whole. Pity, not revenge. That surprised me most of all. That evening, Thomas came by the cottage. He had promised to fix the loose railing on my porch. The sound of his steady hammering filled the quiet dusk. When he finished, we sat together on the steps, watching the first drops of rain fall. "You've been quiet lately," he said gently. "Not prying, just noticing." I hesitated, unsure where to begin. Then, finally, I told him everything about Richard, about the letter, about how the truth had come years too late, but had come nonetheless. Through it all, he didn't interrupt. He just listened, really listened, his hands folded, his eyes steady, his silence patient. When I finished, I couldn't look at him. My voice trembled. I thought I'd feel vindicated, but I don't. I just feel tired. He nodded slowly. That's because what you carried wasn't anger, Evelyn. It was grief. And grief doesn't disappear with proof. It just quiets. He reached for my hand, his touch firm but gentle. Then let this be the past's final breath. The words sank deep. Final breath. I looked out at the rain, now falling harder, washing the dust off the road, as if the world itself wanted to be clean again. For the first time, I believed maybe I could be too. That night, after he left, I stood in front of the small jewelry box on my dresser. Inside lay the wedding ring I hadn't worn in years. I had kept it tucked away, not out of sentiment, but because part of me hadn't been ready to let go completely. It was the last physical piece of a life that had once felt real. I picked it up, turning it between my fingers. The metal was cold, dull, lifeless. It didn't shine anymore. Maybe it never truly had. I thought of all the nights I'd twisted it nervously on my finger, whispering silent prayers for a marriage already dying. I thought of how heavy it had felt back then. Not just the gold, but the guilt it symbolized. Now, it was just metal, nothing more. I opened the drawer of my dresser and placed it inside, beside the folded letter from Dr. Levin, the past and the truth, side by side. Then, I closed the drawer slowly, sealing them both where they belonged. That night, I took off my old wedding ring and placed it in a drawer. It never saw daylight again. It happened under the old oak tree behind my cottage, the one that had stood through every storm, every season, its roots deep and unshakable. I had always loved that tree. It reminded me of what endurance looked like, quiet, grounded, and alive, even after being struck by lightning once. That afternoon, the air smelled of wood shavings and rain. Thomas had spent the morning fixing my porch swing, humming softly as he worked. I watched him from the kitchen window, his sleeves rolled, his movements steady and sure. I remember thinking how peace can sometimes sneak into your life so gently. You don't even realize you've been living in it for months. When he was done, he wiped his hands on his jeans and called out, "Come see?" The swing creaked as I sat down, testing it. "It's perfect," I said, smiling. He looked at me for a long moment, that quiet, thoughtful gaze of his that always made me feel seen and safe. Then he said, almost too softly, "There's one more thing I want to fix today." I laughed. What else could possibly need mending? He took a step closer, and then another, until he was standing in front of me beneath the shade of the oak. The afternoon light filtered through the leaves, dappling his face in gold. He didn't kneel. That wasn't his way. He simply took my hand, his thumb tracing the faint line where a ring once sat. "Evelyn," he said, "I know your heart's seen enough hurt to last a lifetime. I can't erase it. But I can promise you something steady. Not perfect, but steady." My throat tightened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Not velvet, not gold, wood. Simple, handcrafted, smooth from the polish of his own hands. Inside was a modest ring. Silver, with a single small stone. The kind of ring that didn't scream for attention but whispered of care. "I made it myself," he said. "From the first piece of oak I ever worked with here. I thought maybe it could hold something new for both of us." I wanted to say yes. Every part of me did. But fear, that old familiar shadow, crept in before the words could form. What if? I hesitated, searching for breath. What if life takes it all away again? What if I'm not meant to keep happiness? He didn't flinch, didn't rush to comfort me with empty words. He just held my gaze and said, "God doesn't punish, Evelyn. He restores. Sometimes we mistake healing for punishment because it hurts at first. But this..." He squeezed my hand. "This feels like healing to me. Something inside me broke, the brittle shell I'd built around hope." Tears blurred my vision as I whispered, "Yes." He smiled, slipping the ring onto my finger. The fit was perfect. Not tight, not loose, just right, as if it had always belonged there. Under that oak tree, the one that had weathered so many storms, I said yes to a man who didn't need to save me, just to stay. We were married 2 months later, a quiet ceremony in the garden behind the church. Only Clara, a few teachers from school, and Thomas's brother attended. There were no grand speeches, no elaborate decorations, just wildflowers, sunlight, and laughter. When the pastor pronounced us husband and wife, Thomas looked at me as if the world had finally aligned. I felt it too, a peace so full it bordered on sacred. Afterward, we ate lemon cake under the oak. He brushed a crumb from my cheek, and for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't thinking about what came next. I was simply there, alive, whole. Months slipped by in gentle rhythm. Morning walks, evenings by the fire, his hand always finding mine as though it belonged there. And then, one winter morning, everything changed again. I woke feeling unsteady, dizzy, nauseous, and strangely hopeful. It was Clara, ever perceptive, who noticed first. "Evelyn," she said with a smile, "I think you should see a doctor." I laughed it off. But when the days passed and the signs grew stronger, I went. The doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Hensley, smiled warmly after the examination. "Mrs. Reed," she said, her voice soft, "congratulations. You're expecting." For a moment, the world went silent. Expecting. The word echoed through me like a hymn. I laughed. I cried. Then I laughed again through the tears. Because it didn't seem possible. Because it wasn't supposed to be. I thought of Richard's words, his mother's whispers, the years I spent believing I was less than whole. And now, here it was. Life. Quiet, defiant, growing inside me. When I told Thomas, he didn't speak at first. He just pulled me into his arms, holding me so tightly I could feel the tremor of joy in his chest. Then he whispered, "See? God restores." The irony cut deep and healed deeper. Weeks later, lying on the examination table, I heard it for the first time. That rhythmic, pulsing sound filling the room like music, the baby's heartbeat. It was faint, steady, beautiful. I closed my eyes as tears slipped down my cheeks. Because in that moment, every wound, every humiliation, every lonely night finally made sense. Truth had a sound. And it wasn't anger or accusation. It was this, the quiet, defiant rhythm of new life. When I heard the baby's heartbeat for the first time, I thought, this is what truth sounds like. The night Samuel came into the world, the rain fell in soft, forgiving sheets, like heaven was washing the earth clean. I remember the smell of it through the open hospital window. Cool, fresh, full of promise. Labor began at dawn. Slow at first, then with a force that made me tremble. But beneath the pain there was peace, a quiet knowing that this time I wasn't alone. Thomas was there beside me, his calloused hand gripping mine, whispering encouragement between each wave. "You're stronger than this pain," he said, his forehead pressed against mine. "You've already walked through worse." And he was right. Every contraction, every ache felt like an echo of the years I had already survived. The nights I'd wept into a pillow no one heard. The days I'd carried shame that was never mine to bear. This pain was different. It had purpose. It was creation, not destruction. Between breaths, I clutched the small bookmark my mother had given me long ago, the one that carried her favorite verse. Love is patient. Love is kind. It was worn now, edges frayed, ink faded, but its truth had grown brighter with time. "Patience," I whispered between clenched teeth. "I have waited long enough." Hours passed. The doctor's voice rose and fell in calm, practiced tones. Nurses moved softly around me, their faces kind, their smiles steady. And through it all, Thomas stayed, whispering, praying, holding my hand as if he could transfer his strength through touch alone. When the final push came, I felt something inside me shatter, not in pain, but release. And then, A cry, a strong, beautiful, perfect cry. They placed him on my chest, small and warm and impossibly real. His skin against mine felt like sunlight after years of storm. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I just stared. Tiny fingers, soft breaths, a heartbeat that matched my own. Thomas broke first. His tears came silently at first, then freely. He cupped Samuel's head gently, his voice trembling. "He's here," he whispered, as if he couldn't believe it either. "Our boy's here." It was the first time I had ever seen him cry. Richard never had. Not once. Not even when our marriage fell apart. That's when I realized something. Real strength isn't in pride or power. It's in the quiet courage to love again after being broken. The doctor smiled down at us. "He's healthy, Evelyn. You both are." She lingered a moment longer, as if sensing there was more behind my tears than just joy. "You've waited a long time for this, haven't you?" I nodded, unable to find words. She smiled softly. "Then I hope this little one reminds you, sometimes life saves its miracles for when we've almost stopped believing." Her words sank deep. I looked at my son, my miracle, and everything inside me stilled. "Samuel," I whispered. "Your name means God has heard." And I think he finally did. That night, after Thomas had drifted off in the chair beside me, I watched Samuel sleep. His tiny chest rose and fell, his hand curled around my finger. I leaned close and whispered, my voice trembling between gratitude and grief. "He called me barren. But you, my son, are proof that no man decides a woman's worth." A tear slid down my cheek, not of sorrow, but of release. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of what had been taken from me, only the wonder of what had been given back. I thought of all the women who'd been told they were less, who'd been blamed for what they could not control, who'd been made to carry silence like shame, and I realized that I wasn't just holding my son. I was holding every lost piece of myself I'd ever thought was gone for good. Samuel stirred, making a small sound that melted my heart. I smiled through my tears. "Sleep, my love," I whispered. "You're everything they said I'd never have. You're everything I prayed for when I didn't even have the courage to pray anymore." The room was quiet except for the rain tapping softly against the window. Gentle, rhythmic, like the earth itself was blessing us. I closed my eyes, feeling peace for the first time in a decade. The kind of peace that doesn't come from forgetting, but from forgiving, even the unforgivable. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a whisper stirred. A faint tremor of unfinished fate, because life, I had learned, always finds a way to circle back, to test the strength of your healing when you least expect it. I didn't know it yet, but fate would bring Richard back into my life, one final time. The park was bathed in soft autumn gold, the kind of light that made even the dying leaves look alive. Thomas had taken the day off work, insisting that Sam deserved one last adventure before winter. Our son's laughter carried through the crisp air as he chased after a red ball, his curls bouncing, cheeks flushed. Every sound he made felt like music I never thought I'd hear. I sat on the bench, wrapping my scarf tighter as the breeze whispered through the trees. Thomas was a few steps ahead, helping Sam aim his throw, his voice gentle, patient. Watching them together always filled me with something indescribable, gratitude tinged with awe. It had been 6 years since that night in the hospital. 6 years since Samuel came into our lives and stitched together the wounds I once thought would never heal. Life had settled into something quiet and full, a rhythm of laughter, Sunday breakfasts, and small, sacred moments. But fate, I had learned, rarely leaves things unfinished. It happened suddenly, that flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. A man, sitting alone on the far bench, gray hair, shoulders slightly stooped, a posture I recognized even after all these years. Richard. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. He looked thinner, smaller somehow, as if time had been quietly eroding him piece by piece. His once perfect suit was now replaced by a worn jacket, his proud stance replaced by something hollow. He didn't see me at first. His gaze was fixed on Thomas and Sam, the boy running through leaves, the man calling his name with affection. There was a softness in his eyes, a quiet ache. Then Sam turned, and his eyes, those bright hazel eyes that mirrored my own, met Richard's. Something shifted. Richard froze. Slowly, his gaze drifted from the boy to me. Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. The years between us folded into that single second, the bitterness, the humiliation, the grief, the silence. It all hung there, invisible but heavy. He blinked, as if confirming I was real. His mouth opened slightly as though words were fighting their way up from a throat long unused to apology. But then, he saw it. The letter. A corner of the paper peeked from the breast pocket of his jacket. Old, folded, worn thin. I recognized the doctor's handwriting. On the envelope, even from where I sat. The truth he could never escape. The truth that stripped away his pride more effectively than any revenge I could have planned. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the edge of that paper, then stopped. His hand fell back to his lap. He didn't stand. He didn't approach. He just sat there, a man once proud, now haunted by the weight of his own mistakes. And I felt no anger, only peace. Thomas called out, "Evelyn! Look at him go!" Sam had managed to kick the ball all the way across the path. He ran toward me, laughter echoing. "Did you see, Mama? Did you see?" I smiled, brushing his hair from his forehead. "I saw, my love." "You're getting stronger every day," he ran back to Thomas, the moment pulling me back into the warmth of the present. When I glanced toward the bench again, Richard was still there, watching. Our eyes met one last time. There was no hatred left in mine. No need for revenge. No lingering ache. I had everything he'd once told me I would never have. Love, family, belonging. And he had the one thing I once lived with. Emptiness. He gave a faint nod, almost imperceptible, part regret, part surrender. Then he lowered his gaze, staring down at his hands like a man holding ashes. I took Thomas's hand as he came to sit beside me. "Old acquaintance?" he asked softly, following my gaze. "Yes," I said quietly. "A chapter that's finally closed." Thomas squeezed my hand gently. He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. Together, we watched our son chase the last light of day across the park. And for the first time, I truly felt the meaning of grace, not in what was returned to me, but in what I chose not to take back. As we packed up to leave, I glanced over my shoulder one final time. Richard was still there, sitting in the same spot, eyes fixed on Sam, the boy who could have been his, the child he'd never waited to understand, the life that might have been. He looked at my son with a longing that once belonged to me, and that was punishment enough. He looked at my son with a longing that once belonged to me, and that was punishment enough. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in shades of honey and rose. The world felt slower in those evening hours, the kind of quiet that comes only when every storm has passed. I sat on the porch swing, its gentle creak matching the rhythm of my breathing. The air carried the scent of jasmine and wood smoke, the familiar comfort of home. From inside, I could hear Sam's laughter, the sound of a boy trying to teach his father how to build a paper airplane. Thomas's deeper voice followed, half patient, half playful. Their joy floated through the open window, mingling with the chirping of crickets. I smiled. There was a time when silence meant loneliness. Now it meant peace. The old oak tree in the yard stood tall and golden in the fading light. It had seen everything, my tears, my vows, my rebirth. I often thought of it as an old friend, one that listened without judgment. I closed my eyes, letting the soft wind brush across my face. My life had changed in ways I never imagined, not suddenly, but like a tide reshaping the shore, one wave at a time. And somewhere between the ruins of my past and the beauty of my present, I had found myself again. My thoughts wandered, as they often did, to Richard. I hadn't seen him since that day in the park. I didn't need to. The look in his eyes had said everything words could not. Regret had done its work. I bore him no hatred now. The anger that once filled my chest had burned itself out long ago, leaving behind something purer, understanding. He had been a man of pride and fear. Fear of judgment, fear of imperfection, fear that his worth was tied to legacy rather than love, and that fear destroyed him before I ever could. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't a gift you gave to someone else. It was a key that unlocked your own heart. So, that evening, beneath a sky melting into gold, I forgave him, not for his sake, for mine, because carrying the weight of his cruelty any longer would only make me smaller, and I had finally learned to live wide open. Thomas came out onto the porch with 2 cups of tea, steam curling up into the cool air. He handed one to me, his fingers brushing mine. "You look 1,000,000 miles away," he said softly. "Just visiting an old chapter?" I replied. He smiled, settling beside me on the swing. "As long as you don't plan on staying there," I shook my head, smiling. "No, I think that chapter finally closed itself." We sat in silence for a while, watching the last sliver of sun dip beneath the hills. Sam called from inside, asking if he could have just one more cookie. Thomas chuckled and shouted back, "Only if your mother agrees." I laughed, a real laugh, light and effortless. "Go on," I called. But only one. His small feet pattered across the wooden floorboards, his laughter like music that filled every corner of our home. As twilight deepened, I turned to Thomas. "You know," I said quietly, "for years I thought my life had ended the day he left me." Thomas's eyes met mine, patient, knowing. "Maybe it did," he said, "but sometimes endings are just how God clears the path for something truer." I nodded slowly, my throat tight with gratitude. "He thought I'd spend my life empty," I murmured. "But emptiness taught me how to be whole." Thomas reached over and took my hand. His touch was warm, steady, a reminder that love doesn't always arrive in grand gestures, but in the quiet promise of staying. Together, we watched the stars begin to appear, one by one, like blessings written in the dark. And for the first time in a long time, I felt no echo of pain, no shadow of what was lost. Only fullness. A life rebuilt not from vengeance, but from grace. Inside, Sam's laughter rang out again, pure and bright. I leaned back on the swing, closing my eyes as the breeze rustled through the trees. Everything I had once begged for, love, family, belonging, had found its way back to me in a form far gentler than I ever imagined. I had spent years being called barren, hollow, unworthy. But now, as the stars shimmered above and my home hummed with life, I finally understood the truth. I had never been barren at all. I had simply been waiting for the right season to bloom. He called me barren, but my heart was never empty, only waiting.